In the spring of 1992, a man drove the highways of Middle America with a 70-year-old pistol and a fantasy no one could understand. He walked into ordinary shops on ordinary afternoons and changed everything. 6 people died in 29 days. The killer was seen, described, sketched, but he was never found. This is the story of the phantom who traveled Interstate 70, leaving behind only questions that still haunt 5 cities tonight. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore 3 unsettling stories where appearances concealed something far darker. Take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the I-70 killer. Now let's begin. Terry Petter Rasmusen was born in Denver, Colorado, in December 1943. His family moved to Phoenix, Arizona, when he was young. By most accounts, his childhood appeared unremarkable. He attended Phoenix North High School. In 1961, he enlisted in the United States Navy, where he trained as an electrician. He served for 6 years at various bases along the West Coast and spent time stationed in Okinawa before receiving a general discharge in 1967. After leaving the military, Rasmusen moved to Hawaii. He married there and later relocated to Phoenix, where he and his wife had 4 children together. Twin daughters first, then a son, then another daughter. He worked as an electrician, steady employment with a company run by a man named Otto. For a time, the family moved to Redwood City, California, where Rasmusen continued his electrical work in Palo Alto, then back to Phoenix. He also worked in a shoe shop at various points, sometimes alongside his parents. But something shifted in the mid-1970s. In 1974, Rasmusen was arrested in Phoenix for aggravated assault. Shortly after, his wife and children left him. The details of what happened between them have never been fully disclosed, but his family would later say they believed he was either dead or missing. They spent decades searching for him. One of his daughters hired a private investigator in the 1980s, trying to find any trace of the father who had simply vanished from their lives. What no one in his family knew was that Terry Rasmusen had not disappeared from the world. He had simply changed his name. If you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. Tonight's story is about absence, the kind that lingers in doorways and parking lots, in the space between what we know and what we can never quite grasp. If you're settling into sleep, let me tell you about a case that has quietly troubled investigators across the American Midwest for more than 3 decades now. It's not a story of obvious monsters or dramatic chases. Instead, it's something stranger and more unsettling. It's about a man who appeared and disappeared like smoke, who killed without clear reason, and who left behind a trail that goes cold the moment anyone tries to follow it. The case is known by the highway that connects it all, Interstate 70, a long ribbon of asphalt that stretches from Baltimore to Utah, passing through the heartland of America. In the spring of 1992, somewhere along this highway, a killer chose his path. What makes this case unique isn't just that it remains unsolved. It's the nature of the crimes themselves. There was no apparent motive beyond the acts themselves. No sexual assault, no significant theft, no personal connection to the victims. Just sudden, methodical violence in the middle of busy afternoons, and then nothing. As if the whole thing were some kind of terrible performance staged for no audience at all. The victims were ordinary people working ordinary jobs. Store clerks, shop owners, people who happened to be standing behind a counter when a stranger walked through the door. Most of them were young women, petite, with dark hair. They worked in small specialty shops, shoe stores, bridal shops, gift stores, the kind of places that dot strip malls near highway exits all across America. Places where you might stop on a road trip without thinking twice. But someone was thinking about these places. Someone was noticing them. And for 29 days in the spring of 1992, someone was visiting them with a gun. Let's begin where it all began, on a Wednesday afternoon in Indianapolis. when the phone rang at a shoe store and changed the course of everything that followed. Robin Fuldauer was 26 years old in April of 1992, and she had her whole life carefully planned out. She'd been the salutatorian of her high school class at Lawrence Central, just down the street from where she now worked. She'd graduated from Indiana University 4 years earlier. She was the kind of person who did things right, who followed through, who showed up even when it wasn't convenient. That's exactly what she did on April 8th, a Wednesday afternoon that started like any other. The Payless Shoe Source, where Robin worked as manager, sat at 7325 Pendleton Pike, in a small standalone building with its own parking lot. It was less than a quarter-mile from Interstate 465, which connects to Interstate 70 just a short drive away. Across the street was a paint store. Next door, a gas station. Ordinary suburban geography, the kind of place where nothing particularly notable ever happens. Robin wasn't supposed to be working alone that day, but her coworker had called in sick. There were only 2 full-time employees at the store, so when one was absent, the other carried the weight. Robin arrived that morning knowing it would be a long day. She grabbed lunch around noon, eating at the store during the quiet midday hours. Across the street at the paint store, an employee happened to glance out the window sometime that afternoon. What he saw struck him as odd enough to remember later, though not odd enough to act on in the moment. A man was circling the Payless store, carrying a long bag. He walked around the building more than once, then sat down on the curb nearby for close to half an hour, just sitting there watching. Eventually, the man stood up and disappeared. Sometime between 1:30 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, someone entered the Payless Shoe Source. We can imagine Robin looking up from whatever task she was doing, organizing boxes, helping a customer, tallying receipts, and offering the greeting she'd given 1,000 times before. The store was quiet, the parking lot nearly empty. What happened next took only minutes, maybe less. Robin was led to the storage room in the back of the store. There, she was shot twice in the back of the head with a .22 caliber handgun. Less than $100 was taken from the cash register, though it's unclear if the killer took the money before or after. There was no sign of sexual assault, no apparent struggle, just sudden, efficient violence, and then the killer walked out the back door. Robin's body was discovered around 3 o'clock that afternoon. By then, the man who had killed her was already gone, blending into the traffic of a Wednesday afternoon, unremarkable and invisible. Indianapolis Police Detective Mike Crook was called to the scene. He walked into that storage room and saw Robin Fuldauer lying in a pool of blood, and he thought, like any detective would think, that this case would probably be solved quickly. A single victim, a busy area, stores and businesses all around. Surely someone had seen something. There would be witnesses. There would be leads. There would be an arrest. But the days passed, and the phone didn't ring with the tip they needed. What they didn't know yet, what they couldn't have known, was that this wasn't just a homicide. It was the beginning of something that would stretch across 3 states and challenge everything they thought they understood about serial killers. Because 3 days later, the man who killed Robin Fuldauer drove 700 miles west to Wichita, Kansas, and he did it again. La Bride d'Elegance was a bridal shop on West Kellogg Drive in Wichita, tucked into a strip mall along with Sir Knight tuxedo and formal wear. The shop was owned by Patricia Majors, 32 years old, who ran the business with care and attention. Working with her that day was Patricia Smith, 23, who was newer to the job but eager and reliable. It was Saturday, April 11th. The shop was supposed to close at 6 in the evening, but a customer had called with a request. He was running late and needed to pick up a cummerbund for his tuxedo. Could they possibly stay open a little longer, just until 6:30? Patricia and Patricia, their friends called them by their shared first name with affection, agreed without hesitation. That's what you do when you run a small business. You accommodate, you help people, you stay open 15 extra minutes because someone needs a cummerbund. So they waited. At 6:30, the customer arrived at the bridal shop. He walked in expecting to find Patricia and Patricia waiting at the counter, ready with his order. Instead, he found the shop eerily quiet. No one at the register, no one in the front room. He called out. No answer. And then he saw a man. Slender, maybe 5'7", with dull reddish hair. The man was holding something. The customer's mind must have gone to that strange, instinctive place we all go when something feels deeply wrong but we can't quite articulate why. The man with the reddish hair gestured toward the back of the store. He wanted the customer to come with him, to walk to the back. The customer refused. Something in him, some ancient warning system buried deep in the human brain, told him to get out. He turned and left the store quickly, walking back to his car with his heart pounding. He sat in his car for a moment, trying to process what had just happened, trying to convince himself it was nothing. Maybe he'd misread the situation. Maybe he was overreacting, but the unease wouldn't leave him. Still, it took over an hour before he finally called the police. When officers arrived at La Brie d'Elegance, they found Patricia Majors and Patricia Smith in the back room, where the man had wanted the customer to go. Both women had been shot in the head with a .22 caliber weapon. Both had died where they fell. Again, only a small amount of money was missing, if any. No sexual assault. No signs of a prolonged confrontation. Just sudden, purposeful execution, and then the killer had walked out, past the customer who'd refused to follow him, and vanished into the Kansas evening. The customer was able to provide a description. That description would become crucial, would be refined into a composite sketch, would be distributed to police departments across the Midwest. A thin white man, maybe in his 20s or 30s, around 5'7", reddish or sandy blonde hair, a weathered look, lazy eyelids. But here's what made investigators' blood run cold. When they ran ballistics on the bullets recovered from Patricia Majors and Patricia Smith, they matched the bullets that had killed Robin Fuldauer in Indianapolis 3 days earlier. The same gun, the same killer, 700 miles apart. Suddenly, Indianapolis and Wichita police departments realized they weren't dealing with isolated homicides. They were dealing with a serial killer who was mobile, confident, and apparently just getting started. He was driving the highways of Middle America, choosing his exits, choosing his victims, killing with a precision that suggested planning, and then disappearing before anyone could quite process what had happened. The question everyone was asking, where would he go next? For 2 weeks after Wichita, there was silence. No reports of similar crimes. No more bodies. Investigators dared to hope that maybe it was over. Maybe the killer had stopped. Maybe he'd been arrested for something else or left the region or simply decided he was done. These were thin hopes, but they were something to hold onto in the absence of answers. Then, on April 27th, the silence broke. Terre Haute, Indiana sits about 70 miles west of Indianapolis, right along Highway 41, which intersects with Interstate 70. It's a small city, the kind of place where people know their neighbors and small businesses are woven into the fabric of daily life. Sylvia's Ceramics was one of those businesses. It sat at 2615 South 3rd Street, in a shopping center not far from the highway. The shop had been owned by a woman named Sylvia McCown, but by 1992, her son Michael, known as Mick to everyone who knew him, had taken over the business. Mick was 40 years old, a former bass player who'd toured the country in his younger days before settling down to run his mother's shop. He was slightly built, with long hair he often wore in a ponytail. He was gentle, artistic, beloved by his family and friends. On the morning of April 27th, Mick had a doctor's appointment. He returned to the shop in the early afternoon and went about his work, stocking shelves, organizing inventory, the routine tasks of running a small retail business. Sometime just after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, someone walked into Sylvia's Ceramics. Mick never saw who it was. He was kneeling down, stocking shelves, his back to the door. He never had a chance to turn around. The killer shot him once in the back of the head from about 4 inches away. Mick's wallet was taken. Less than $50 was stolen from the store. When police processed the scene and ran ballistics, they found what they were dreading. Same gun. Same killer. The man who had murdered Robin Fuldauer and the 2 Patricias had now killed Mick McCown. But this murder introduced a puzzle. All the other victims had been women, young, petite, dark-haired women working alone in small shops. Mick was a man. Why had the killer chosen him? investigators developed a theory that still holds today. The store was called Sylvia's Ceramics. From the outside, that name suggests a woman owns or works there. And Mick, with his long hair and slight build, viewed from behind as he knelt to stock shelves, might easily have been mistaken for a woman. The killer may have walked in expecting to find a female clerk and shot Mick before realizing his mistake. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. Either way, the pattern was clear now. The killer was targeting small specialty shops near Interstate 70. He was looking for stores where one person worked alone. He was walking in during business hours in broad daylight, leading or forcing his victims to the back of the store, and killing them with cold efficiency. And then he was vanishing. Police departments across the Midwest were now in communication, sharing information, comparing notes. The FBI was brought in to develop a profile, but the killer was still moving. 6 days after Mick McCown's murder, he struck again, this time in Missouri. The Bogey Hills Plaza in St. Charles, Missouri was brand new in 1992. It was a bright, modern shopping center just off Interstate 70, the kind of development that represented growth and prosperity. People were excited about it. The stores were clean, well-lit, welcoming. It was supposed to be a place where nothing bad could happen. Boot Village was one of the shops in this new plaza, a store specializing in Western wear and footwear. On Sunday, May 3rd, 1992, Nancy Kitzmiller was working there. She was 24 years old, a graduate of Fort Zumwalt High School and Oklahoma State University. She had her whole life ahead of her, all the usual dreams and plans that young people have. That Sunday was supposed to be just another shift, another ordinary day. It was a beautiful spring afternoon. Just a few blocks away, a St. Louis Cardinals baseball game was playing on the radio. The shopping center was busy with weekend traffic, people coming and going, the normal flow of suburban life. It should have been the safest possible scenario. Bright daylight, lots of people around, a new building with good visibility. But sometime that afternoon, a man walked into Boot Village. Nancy was led to the back room of the store. There, she was shot in the head with a .22 caliber weapon. Cash was missing from the store, though not much. Customers found her body. They'd walked into Boot Village looking for shoes or boots, and instead found a young woman dead in the back room. By the time police arrived, by the time they processed the scene and ran the ballistics, the killer was already gone. When the bullet was analyzed, it matched. Same gun that killed Robin, both Patricius and Mick. The same killer had now struck in 5 locations across 3 states. Detective work is often about patterns, about finding the threads that connect seemingly random events. And now a clear pattern was emerging. All the crimes occurred in small specialty shops, shoe stores, bridal shops, ceramic stores, boot stores. All were located within easy reach of Interstate 70. All happened during normal business hours. The victims were predominantly young, petite women with dark hair, though Mick had broken that pattern. The weapon was consistently a .22 caliber handgun, and the killer took very little money, suggesting that robbery wasn't really the motive at all. The FBI profile team was brought in. They analyzed the crime scenes, the victimology, the timing, everything they could gather. And what they came up with was puzzling. Most serial killers have a clear motive. Ted Bundy was motivated by sexual violence and control. John Wayne Gacy was acting out rage and sadistic impulses. Jeffrey Dahmer was trying to create compliant companions. The patterns are disturbing, but they make a certain terrible sense. This killer? The FBI profilers had no clear answer. As profiler Larry Ankrum would later say, nobody does anything like this. Just driving along a highway, picking exits at random, walking into stores and killing people for no apparent reason. It was almost like a game or a fantasy being acted out, but what fantasy? What internal logic was driving this person? The profilers theorized that the killer might be fulfilling some kind of personal script. That the first victim, Robin Fuldauer in Indianapolis, was probably killed close to where the killer lived or worked, establishing a home base. After that first success, it became a challenge, a test. Could he do it again? Could he get away with it in another city? And when he did, the game escalated. They believed the gun itself held significance. The weapon was eventually identified as likely being an Irma Werke, a World War I-era German naval target pistol. This was not a common weapon. It was old, possibly passed down through a family, barely functional. Not the kind of gun you'd choose for a murder spree unless you had some emotional connection to it. Unless it meant something to you personally. But what did all of this add up to? A white male, probably in his late 20s or 30s. Possibly with some military connection or family military history, given the weapon. Someone who traveled, who was comfortable on highways, who could blend into any shopping center anywhere. Someone who was organized enough to plan these attacks but also spontaneous enough to strike in broad daylight. Someone who felt no apparent remorse, who could kill and then calmly walk away, maybe even stop for gas or food, then continue driving. St. Charles Police, along with investigators from Indianapolis, Wichita, and Terre Haute, were now working together, sharing everything they had. They were checking hotel registrations along Interstate 70, looking for names that appeared in multiple cities at the right times. They were reviewing security footage from gas stations and rest stops. They were interviewing witnesses, creating composite sketches, following up on tips. And they were waiting because they knew he wasn't done. The killings had an escalating quality. 4 days between Indianapolis and Wichita. 16 days between Wichita and Terre Haute. 6 days between Terre Haute and St. Charles. The pattern was tightening, becoming more frequent. For days after Nancy Kitzmiller was killed in St. Charles, the killer struck again. Raytown, Missouri is a suburb of Kansas City, about 240 miles west of St. Charles. The store of many colors sat in a shopping plaza, a gift shop owned and operated by Sarah Blessing and her husband Raymond. They had been living their dream, running a business together, sharing handmade gifts and crafts with their community. On May 7, 1992, Sarah was working in the shop. It was a Thursday afternoon, normal business hours, the kind of day she'd worked hundreds of times before. In the store next door, a video rental shop, the owner was going about his usual routine. Then he heard it. Pop. Just one. Sharp and out of place, but not immediately alarming. The kind of sound that makes you pause and wonder what it was. He looked outside and saw a man leaving the store of many colors. The man was walking at a normal pace, not running, not hurrying. Just walking away like anyone might walk out of any store after making a purchase. The video store owner felt that same instinctive unease. He walked over to the store of many colors to check on Sarah. He found her in the back of the shop, where she'd been shot in the head. She was 37 years old. She left behind a husband and a community that loved her. A clerk from a nearby grocery store also saw the killer after he left the shop. The man was walking up a hill toward Interstate 70, carrying himself with confidence, not looking back. By the time police arrived, by the time anyone fully understood what had happened, he was gone. Vanished into the flow of highway traffic, just another car among thousands. When ballistics came back, they confirmed what everyone already knew by now. Same gun, same killer. 6 people dead in 29 days across 3 states, all within a short distance of Interstate 70. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The weeks after Sarah Blessing's murder were tense. Every police department involved was on high alert, expecting another call, another victim, another city added to the map of this killer's journey. Detectives worked overtime, following up on every tip that came in. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted. Composite sketches were distributed throughout the Midwest and beyond. Hotels and motels near Interstate 70 were contacted, asked to review their guest registrations for suspicious patterns. But no new murders came. May turned to June. June to July. Summer stretched out, and the killer seemed to have simply evaporated. This raised more questions. Why did he stop? Serial killers typically don't just stop killing, especially mid-spree. The pattern had been escalating, the time between murders shrinking. And then nothing. There were theories, each as plausible as the next. Maybe the killer had been arrested for some unrelated crime and was now in jail somewhere, unable to continue. Maybe he died. Accident, illness, suicide. Maybe he'd moved out of the region, out of the country even. Maybe he'd found some other outlet for whatever drove him. Maybe he'd gotten married, settled down, started a new life. Maybe the publicity had scared him. Maybe he'd accomplished whatever goal existed in his mind and simply walked away. The frustration for investigators was immense. They had witnesses. They had descriptions. They had composite sketches that were remarkably similar between Indianapolis and St. Charles. They had ballistics linking all the crimes. They had the weapon type. They had the modus operandi. They had a clear geographic pattern. They had everything except the one thing that mattered. They didn't have him. The FBI profile went through multiple iterations. The St. Charles Police Department took the lead on coordinating information since they had the most recent crime scene. Detectives from all 5 cities stayed in regular contact. The case remained open and active, but as the months passed without new leads, without new evidence, the trail grew colder. And then, just when it seemed like the case might fade into the archives of unsolved crimes, something happened that reignited everything. A year later, in Texas, women started dying in the same way. On September 25, 1993, 16 months after Sarah Blessing was murdered in Raytown, a woman named Mary Ann Glasscock was shot and killed in Fort Worth, Texas. She was 51 years old, working at the Emporium Antique Store. The store was located in a strip mall, close to an interstate highway. Mary Ann was shot in the head. It was daytime. Little money was taken. 5 weeks later, on November 1st, a 22-year-old woman named Amy Vess was shot to death inside the Dancer's Closet, a dance apparel store in Arlington, Texas. Again, the location was a small specialty shop in a strip mall near a highway. Again, she was shot in the head during business hours. Again, minimal theft. Then, in March of 1994, a woman named Vicki Webb was working at a gift shop in Houston when a man walked in and shot her. But Vicki did something extraordinary. She played dead. She remained motionless until the shooter left, then managed to get help. She survived, and she could describe what happened. The pattern was eerily familiar. Small shops, female clerks, daytime attacks, minimal theft, execution-style shootings, highway proximity. The geography had shifted south, but the method was the same. The question that immediately arose: was this the same killer? Had the I-70 killer moved to Texas? Ballistics tests were run. And here's where things get complicated. The gun used in the Texas shootings was not the same gun used in the Midwest murders. Different weapon, different bullets. This created a split among investigators that persists to this day. Some detectives, like Mike Crook from Indianapolis, are convinced it's the same person. He's been to all the crime scenes, both Midwest and Texas, and he says the similarities are too striking to ignore. The victimology, the methodology, the locations, the timing, everything matches except the weapon. And a killer could easily have switched weapons, especially if he thought the Irma Huerca was too distinctive, too traceable after the publicity surrounding the Midwest cases. Other investigators are more cautious. Different gun means different killer in their assessment. And the gap of more than a year between the Midwest and Texas cases suggests separate actors. Serial killers rarely take such long breaks in the middle of active periods. The debate has never been resolved. The Texas cases remain officially unsolved, just like the Midwest cases. There's no definitive proof linking them, but there's no definitive proof excluding them either. They exist in that uncertain space where patterns seem meaningful but evidence is ambiguous. What we do know is this: after Vicki Webb survived her attack in Houston in 1994, the Texas killings stopped. Whoever was responsible, whether it was the I-70 killer or someone else, seemed to disappear again. And that's where things stood for years. The case files remained open but grew dusty. Detectives retired. New detectives took over the cases as cold case assignments. The families of the victims mourned and tried to rebuild their lives around the absence of their loved ones. The communities where the killings occurred slowly moved forward, though the memories never quite faded. Then, on November 30th, 2001, nearly a decade after the original killing spree, Something happened in Terre Haute that made everyone wonder if the nightmare was starting again. The 7 and 70 liquor store sat at the corner of 7th Street and Highway 41 in Terre Haute. On the evening of November 30th, 23-year-old Billy Brosman was working alone. Security cameras captured what happened next. A white male entered the store. He pulled a gun on Billy at the register, then led him to the back of the store. Billy was shot once in the back of the head. He died instantly. The murder occurred just 7 blocks from where Mick McCown had been killed 9 years earlier. But here's what made this case both tragic and potentially crucial. Unlike the 1992 murders, this time there was security footage. Clear video of the killer's face, his movements, his mannerisms. Police suddenly had something they'd never had before, a visual record of what might be the I-70 killer in action. The modus operandi matched perfectly. Small store, solo employee, daytime hours, highway proximity, execution-style shooting, minimal theft, same city where Mick McCown had been killed. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Detectives immediately began comparing the security footage to the composite sketches from 1992 and witness descriptions. Several people who knew a particular suspect said he matched the man in the video. The suspect claimed he'd worked for a large department store, traveling the country doing remodeling jobs. He admitted he'd been in Terre Haute in 2001. Terre Haute police prepared a murder warrant. They felt they had their man. They were ready to move forward with charges. But the prosecutor refused to sign the warrant. There wasn't enough evidence to guarantee a conviction. The suspect couldn't be definitively placed at the scene of Billy's murder or linked to any of the I-70 cases. The ballistics from Billy's case couldn't be conclusively matched to the 1992 weapon. Without DNA, without witnesses who could positively identify the suspect as being in the liquor store, without physical evidence tying him to the crime, the case couldn't move forward. So the suspect walked free. He's still alive today, living somewhere in the Midwest. Detectives know who he is. They believe he's connected to at least some of these cases. But belief isn't proof. Suspicion isn't evidence. And in the American legal system, you can't charge someone with murder based on resemblance and coincidence. The frustration this caused among investigators was profound. They'd been chasing this case for nearly a decade. They'd watched it grow cold. And now, when they finally had a suspect, when they finally had video evidence, it still wasn't enough. Billy Brosman's case remains officially unsolved, like all the others. Whether his murder was the work of the I-70 killer or a copycat or a completely separate crime is still a matter of debate. What's clear is that whoever killed those 6 people in 1992 achieved something that very few serial killers ever do. They completely vanished, leaving behind only questions. More than 3 decades have passed since Robin Fuldauer was shot in that Indianapolis shoe store. The world has changed almost beyond recognition. The internet has transformed how we communicate and investigate. DNA technology has advanced exponentially. Security cameras are everywhere now. Cell phone tracking, license plate readers, facial recognition software, all tools that didn't exist or were primitive in 1992. And yet, the I-70 killer has never been identified. In 2021, nearly 30 years after the murders, police departments from all the affected cities came together to form a new task force. Detectives from Indianapolis, Wichita, Terre Haute, St. Charles, and Raytown met in St. Louis, bringing with them all the evidence they'd accumulated over the decades. They compared notes, shared theories, looked at the cases with fresh eyes and new technology. The FBI and ATF joined the effort. Cold case specialists were brought in. The evidence was re-examined using modern forensic techniques. DNA samples that had been collected in 1992 were run through updated databases. Age-progressed versions of the original composite sketches were created, showing what the killer might look like today. A man now in his 50s, probably with gray hair, possibly heavier, but still with those distinctive lazy eyelids. The task force worked for months. They generated new leads, followed up on old tips that had never been fully investigated, reached out to witnesses whose memories might have clarified over time. The case was featured again on television shows, this time with modern production values and wider reach. The St. Charles Police Department created a dedicated webpage for the case, with a tip portal where anyone could submit information anonymously, and tips did come in. Dozens of them, then hundreds. Each one had to be followed up, investigated, ruled in or ruled out. Some were credible. Many weren't. People called to report relatives who fit the description, neighbors who acted strangely, men they'd known decades ago who talked about the case with suspicious knowledge. Each lead had to be run down. But as of now, early 2025, the case remains unsolved. The killer has never been identified. No arrests have been made. The 6 murders, Robin Fuldauer, Patricia Majors, Patricia Smith, Michael McCown, Nancy Kitzmiller, and Sarah Blessing, remain open cases in 5 different jurisdictions. The families of the victims have lived with this absence for over 30 years now. Robin's family never got to see her marry, never got to meet her children. Patricia Majors' bridal shop closed. Patricia Smith's dreams ended at 23. Mick McCown's music went silent. Nancy Kitzmiller's degree went unused. Sarah Blessing's gift shop became someone else's bakery, though the new owner still remembers what happened there and still hopes for closure. These people weren't famous. They weren't wealthy or powerful. They were ordinary Americans working ordinary jobs, trying to build ordinary lives. And someone took that from them for reasons no one has ever understood. The detectives who worked this case have aged along with it. Mike Crook, who responded to Robin's murder in 1992, spent over 30 years at the Indianapolis Police Department, half that time hunting killers. When he retired, he became police chief of Cumberland, but he never completely dropped the I-70 case. For him and many others, this is the one case they want solved before they retire or die. The one case that haunts them. We decided, no, we're good. Somebody will call in. Crook remembered about those early days after Robin's murder. But all of a sudden, we're not hearing anything for several days. And then those days turned into weeks, months, years, decades. The silence stretched out. The killer remained invisible. There are several possible explanations for why this case has never been solved, each frustrating in its own way. First, the killer was disciplined. He didn't leave obvious evidence. No fingerprints were recovered that led anywhere. The DNA samples collected were either too degraded or didn't match anyone in any database. The killer probably wore gloves, was careful about what he touched, understood basic forensic awareness even in 1992. Second, he was mobile. He didn't kill in his own neighborhood or even his own state. He traveled, which meant he could commit a crime in Indianapolis and be back home in Chicago or St. Louis or Louisville before the body was even discovered. The mobility made it nearly impossible to establish a geographic profile that would narrow down where he lived. Third, the crimes themselves were puzzling in a way that made traditional investigative techniques less effective. Most murders have clear motives: jealousy, anger, financial gain, sexual violence. These are things investigators understand, things they can follow. But these murders seemed almost motiveless beyond the act itself. The small amounts of money taken were almost incidental. There was no sexual component, no personal connection, no apparent rage or emotional investment, just cold, methodical killing. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the killer stopped before making a fatal mistake. Most serial killers are caught because they escalate until they become sloppy, or because they can't stop themselves and eventually kill someone connected to them, or because they're caught committing some other crime and their DNA links them to previous murders. This killer simply stopped or appeared to stop before any of those things happened. But did he really stop? Or did he just stop killing in ways that could be linked? This is one of the questions that haunts investigators. Serial killers rarely just quit. The compulsion that drives them doesn't typically go away on its own. So what happened to the I-70 killer? Maybe he was arrested for something else, assault, robbery, drug charges, and has been in prison ever since, unable to continue killing but never connected to these crimes because his DNA was never uploaded to the right databases or his prints were never in the system. Maybe he died shortly after the last murder. Car accident, illness, suicide. The statistics on this are grim but real. Many serial killers do eventually take their own lives, either because they're about to be caught or because the same darkness that drove them to kill also leads them to end their own existence. Maybe he left the country, moved to Canada or Mexico or Europe and started a new life, either continuing to kill in ways that were never connected to the I-70 cases or somehow managing to stop. Maybe he found some other outlet, got married, had children, threw himself into work or religion or some other consuming pursuit that channeled whatever dark impulse had driven him to murder. Or maybe he's still out there, living a completely ordinary life, shopping at grocery stores and going to work and watching television, and occasionally thinking about those 29 days in the spring of 1992 when he drove the highways of Middle America and killed 6 people for reasons only he understands. The question that echoes through this entire case is simply, why? Why these particular shops? Why these particular people? Why this particular gun? Why stop when he did? Why do any of it at all? FBI profiler Larry Ankrum, who worked on the case, said something that gets at the heart of the mystery. Nobody does anything like this. Other serial killers, as terrible as they are, have comprehensible motives. But this killer just drove along the highway, picked exits, walked into stores, and shot people. Could have been anywhere. Could have been anyone. That randomness is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the whole case. We want crimes to make sense. We want to understand the why because understanding creates a sense of order, of predictability, of safety. We tell ourselves that if we just avoid certain situations or people, if we're careful, if we're aware, we'll be okay. But the I-70 case doesn't offer that comfort. Robin, both Patricius, Mick, Nancy, Sarah, they did nothing wrong. They weren't in dangerous situations. They were at work in busy shopping areas during daylight hours. They were doing everything right, being responsible, showing up, helping customers. And someone killed them anyway. The randomness is the horror. Some criminologists have theorized that the killer was acting out a fantasy. But if so, what fantasy? What internal narrative would drive someone to kill store clerks in such a methodical way? The FBI suggested the crimes might have been some kind of game or challenge. Could he kill in different cities without getting caught? Could he maintain his composure, walk in and out of these shops without anyone stopping him? Was it about feeling powerful, feeling invisible, feeling like he controlled life and death? We'll probably never know for certain. Unless the killer is caught, unless he confesses, unless someone who knew him comes forward with information that cracks the case open, the motive will remain speculation. What we do know is that somewhere, someone knows something. Someone saw something. Someone might even be living with someone whose behavior in the spring of 1992 changed in ways that seemed odd at the time but not quite suspicious enough to report. That's why the case remains open, why detectives still follow up on tips, why the composite sketches are still distributed, why the tip line is still active. Because cold cases are only truly cold until the moment they're not. New technology opens new possibilities. Old witnesses remember new details. People who were protecting someone decide after 30 years that they can't live with the secret anymore. Deathbed confessions happen. DNA databases grow. The truth is out there, somewhere waiting to be found. For the communities where these murders occurred, the case left a permanent mark. Raytown, where Sarah Blessing died, still has businesses in the same plaza where the store of many colors once stood. Elisa Breitenbach, who owns a bakery there now, grew up in Raytown and remembers when it happened. She remembers the fear, the shock, the way it changed how people thought about safety in their own neighborhood. They were living out their dream, she said about Sarah and her husband Raymond. The all-American dream, doing what they truly love doing and sharing with this community the wonderful gifts that they've made. That dream ended in a moment, and the ripples are still felt. Every few years, a reporter comes back to do a story on the anniversary. Every time, Breitenbach hopes it's because the case has finally been solved. Every time, it's just another reminder that the killer is still out there, unknown and unpunished. The same is true in Indianapolis, where a Batteries Plus store now sits where the Payless once stood. In Wichita, where the bridal shop is long gone. In Terre Haute, where Sylvia's Ceramics is no longer. In St. Charles, where the Bogey Hills Plaza has changed and evolved over 3 decades. The physical locations have transformed, but the memories remain. Detectives from all 5 cities have said this is the case they want solved more than any other. It's the one that keeps them up at night, the one they think about during quiet moments, the one they can't quite let go of even in retirement. Because the families deserve answers. Because the victims deserve justice. Because someone got away with murder, and that's intolerable. As of this moment, the I-70 killer would be in his 50s or early 60s if he's still alive. His hair would be gray or white. He might be heavier. He might have health problems. But those eyes, those lazy eyelids that witnesses remembered so clearly, those wouldn't have changed. He might be a father now, maybe a grandfather. He might have lived an entire life since those 29 days in 1992. He might think about what he did often or never. He might feel remorse or feel nothing at all. He might be proud of the fact that he was never caught, or terrified that every knock on the door is finally the police coming for him. We don't know who he is. We don't know where he is. We don't know if he's reading this story right now, feeling some combination of fear and nostalgia. But here's what investigators want the killer to know. If he is out there, they haven't forgotten. The families haven't forgotten. The case isn't dead. Science keeps improving. People keep talking. Secrets have a way of surfacing decades later. And all it takes is one piece of evidence, one witness who finally comes forward, one mistake that was made in 1992 but can finally be understood in 2025. The highway still runs from Baltimore to Utah. The exits are still there. The shopping centers have changed, but new ones have replaced them. Life goes on as it always does, but 6 people died along that highway and someone knows why. Someone knows who. And until that someone speaks, the case remains open, the families remain in limbo, and the ghost of the I-70 killer continues to haunt the Midwest. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The killings of Jacqueline Lard and Amy Baker. Sometimes the answers we seek are hidden in plain sight for decades, locked within evidence waiting for the right key. In 1986, a mother of 2 vanished from her workplace on an ordinary Friday night. 3 years later, an 18-year-old woman disappeared from the side of a highway. The connection between these 2 deaths would remain invisible for nearly 40 years, until science finally revealed what investigators had been unable to see. Tonight, we're going to explore a case that spans nearly 4 decades, 2 communities in Virginia, and the evolution of forensic science itself. This is a story about patience, about families who refused to stop searching for answers, and about investigators who kept boxes of evidence safe for generations, believing that one day technology might catch up to their questions. What you're about to hear is the true account of Jacqueline Lard and Amy Baker, 2 women who lived separate lives but shared a terrible connection neither would ever know about. Their stories unfolded in the shadow of the nation's capital, in the suburban sprawl of Northern Virginia, where strip malls and housing developments pressed against patches of old woodland. These were places where people felt safe, where they locked their doors but didn't really expect danger to come knocking. The mid to late 1980s were a particular moment in American history. The Cold War still dominated international relations, and in the Washington area, that meant a constant presence of federal agencies, military installations, and the people who worked for them. Suburban communities like Stafford County were growing rapidly, bedroom communities for people who commuted into D.C. or worked at nearby government facilities. Life moved at its own rhythm there, faster than small-town rural America, but not quite matching the intensity of the city. This is a long story, and we'll move through it slowly, methodically, the way investigators themselves had to work through decades of dead ends and false hopes. If you're listening to help you sleep, That's perfectly fine. The details will be here, steady and calm, as we follow this case from its beginning through to its resolution. There's no rush. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that unfold gradually, revealing themselves piece by piece. Let's begin. On the evening of November 14th, 1986, Jacqueline Lard was 40 years old and working at Mount Vernon Realty in Stafford County, Virginia. The office sat in a strip of businesses along Garrisonville Road, one of those commercial corridors that defined suburban Virginia in that era. The Realty office was modest, functional, the kind of place where people came to discuss mortgages and property listings, dreaming about their next home or their first investment. Jackie, as most people knew her, had taken a job in real estate as many people did back then, looking for flexible work that could accommodate family life. She was married to a Drug Enforcement Administration agent, a detail that would later bring the FBI into the investigation. They had 2 children, a daughter who was 13 and a son who was 7. That November night, her husband was away on assignment in Costa Rica, and the children were staying with family friends. It was a Friday, and Jackie was scheduled to work the evening shift, closing up the office at 9 o'clock. Northern Virginia in November carries a particular quality. The days grow short, darkness arriving early and settling in with a damp chill that seeps through clothing. By 9 o'clock on a November evening, the commercial strips would be mostly empty, cars and parking lots thinning out as businesses closed, streetlights casting orange pools across asphalt. It was the kind of time and place where someone working alone might feel the weight of solitude, the awareness of emptiness beyond the lit windows. The real estate office was a place Jackie knew well. She understood its routines, its rhythms, the way the day wound down toward closing time. There would have been paperwork to organize, lights to turn off, doors to lock. The ordinary rituals of ending a workday, preparing to go home to an empty house to wait for her children to return the next day and her husband to come back from his trip. But that night, something interrupted those familiar patterns. We know that Jackie was last seen around 9 o'clock when the business closed. We know she never made it home. What happened in the space between those 2 facts would become a question that haunted investigators for nearly 4 decades. The next morning, Saturday, November 15th, employees from other businesses in the strip began arriving to open for the day. What they found at Mount Vernon Realty made them immediately call the police. The scene inside told a story of violence. Blood marked the walls and floors. The office showed clear signs of what investigators would later describe as a horrific struggle. Jackie's belongings were scattered, some of them found outside the building, blood-stained business cards and papers strewn down an embankment. One of her black shoes lay among the debris. Her champagne-colored 1985 Nissan was gone, and so was Jackie. The Stafford County Sheriff's Office responded first, but given Jackie's connection to federal law enforcement through her husband, the investigation quickly expanded. Virginia State Police joined in along with the FBI. They processed the scene methodically, photographing, documenting, collecting evidence. They found blood that would later be confirmed as Jackie's. They found other biological evidence, traces that would be preserved and stored, though the technology to fully analyze it didn't yet exist. For the investigators working that Saturday morning, the scene presented a clear narrative of violence, but offered frustratingly few answers about where Jackie had been taken or who had taken her. Her vehicle became a key focus. If they could find the car, they might find Jackie. Alerts went out across the region. The search for Jackie Lard involved multiple agencies and jurisdictions, an extensive effort that reflected both the seriousness with which authorities treated her disappearance and the resources available due to her husband's position. Police officers fanned out across the area. Her photograph appeared in news coverage. Tips came in, were checked, led nowhere. Then, on Sunday, November 16th, 2 children playing in a wooded area near Railroad Avenue in Woodbridge, Virginia, made a discovery that no child should have to make. They found a body hidden beneath a pile of old carpet, dumped material that someone had used to try to conceal their crime. The body was Jackie Lard. Woodbridge was in Prince William County, not far from Stafford but across jurisdictional lines, which meant coordination between even more agencies. The scene was processed carefully. Jackie's body bore signs of the violence she had endured. An orange dog leash was knotted around her neck. The medical examiner's findings confirmed what the scene at the office had suggested. Jackie had fought for her life. The discovery of Jackie's body transformed the case from a missing person investigation to a homicide, but it didn't bring investigators any closer to identifying who had killed her. The brutality of the crime, the randomness of it, the fact that it had happened to someone connected to federal law enforcement all combined to create intense pressure to solve the case quickly. Jackie's family began the terrible process of grief, made worse by the absence of answers. Her husband returned from Costa Rica to find his wife gone. Her teenage daughter and young son had to confront a loss that no amount of preparation could have made bearable. And hanging over all of it was the question that would not go away. Who did this and why? The FBI's involvement meant that the investigation had significant resources. Agents interviewed numerous people, following up on any possible lead. They looked at Jackie's life, her contacts, her work, searching for anyone who might have had a reason to target her. They found nothing. There was no evidence that Jackie had been specifically selected, no indication of a stalker or a grudge or a personal connection to her killer. The randomness of it made the crime even more disturbing. In 1986, DNA analysis was still in its infancy as a forensic tool. The FBI had begun using DNA evidence in criminal investigations only that same year. The techniques were new, expensive, and not widely available. The evidence collected at the Mount Vernon Realty office and from Jackie's body was carefully preserved, but investigators couldn't yet unlock what it might tell them about the identity of her killer. More than a month after Jackie's disappearance, on December 18th, her champagne-colored Nissan was found abandoned in Fairfax County. The discovery gave investigators additional evidence to work with. They processed the vehicle carefully, finding blood inside and a hair that didn't belong to Jackie. These became part of the growing file of evidence that investigators hoped would someday lead them to answers. But as weeks turned into months, the case grew cold. Investigators had worked it intensively, following every lead, interviewing persons of interest, but nothing connected to a specific suspect. The DNA evidence existed, preserved in storage, but without a suspect to compare it to, it remained just evidence without context. The years began to pass. 1987 came and went. Jackie's family continued to grieve, continued to wait for answers that didn't come. Her husband gave interviews, talking about the roller coaster of hope and disappointment that characterized their search for justice. The children grew older, carrying the weight of their mother's unsolved murder. And then, less than 3 years after Jackie Lard's death, another young woman went missing under circumstances that would eventually prove to be connected in ways no one yet understood. March 29, 1989, was a Monday evening. Amy Baker was 18 years old, recently graduated from her GED program, living with her parents in their new home in Stafford County. The family had recently moved from Falls Church, a transition that took Amy away from familiar surroundings and into a more suburban setting. Like many 18-year-olds, Amy was navigating that uncertain space between adolescence and adulthood, figuring out what came next. That evening, Amy had been visiting family in Falls Church, spending time with an aunt in the area where the family had previously lived. Around 8:30 in the evening, she called her parents to tell them she was heading home. She would be taking Interstate 95, the major north-south corridor that connected the Virginia suburbs with the broader region. Her father, Mark Baker, told her to wait until after rush hour to make the drive. It was practical advice, the kind of small concern that parents express without thinking much about it. But Amy didn't wait. She started her drive back to Stafford County, heading south on I-95. Somewhere along that route, likely near the Backlick Road exit in Springfield, her car ran out of gas. It's the kind of thing that can happen to anyone, especially to young drivers still learning to monitor fuel gauges and plan accordingly. She pulled over to the side of the interstate, likely intending to walk to the nearest gas station. At approximately 9:55 that evening, a Virginia state trooper noticed Amy's vehicle sitting by the roadside near the exit ramp. The car was unoccupied. The trooper documented its location, but seeing no signs of distress or danger, moved on. The next morning, seeing the car still in the same position, the trooper assumed it had been abandoned and arranged to have it towed. Amy never made it home that night. When she didn't return, her parents waited, expecting her at any moment, then growing concerned as hours passed. The next morning, Sue Baker, Amy's mother, called the police to report her daughter missing. The police informed her that Amy's car had been towed. Sue and her sister went to retrieve it, finding Amy's belongings still inside, untouched. But there was no sign of Amy. The discovery that Amy's car had been found but Amy herself remained missing triggered an immediate search. Police returned to the area where the vehicle had been abandoned. They searched the woods near the exit ramp with officers, a search dog, and even a helicopter. Despite these efforts, they found nothing. 2 days after Amy's disappearance, on March 31st, Sue Baker and her sister decided to search the area themselves. They went to the wooded area near where Amy's car had been found, looking in places the official search might have missed. And there, partially hidden under leaves, they found Amy's body. The medical examiner determined that Amy had been strangled. There were signs of violence. The forensic evidence suggested that Amy had encountered someone after her car ran out of gas, someone who had taken advantage of her vulnerability. Detectives theorized that she had been walking toward a gas station when the encounter occurred. For Sue and Mark Baker, the discovery brought the terrible certainty of death but no closure. They had found their daughter, but they didn't know who had killed her or why. The randomness of it, the simple bad luck of running out of gas in the wrong place at the wrong time, made it almost unbearable. The Fairfax County Police Department took over the investigation. Like the Lard case, the Baker investigation involved careful collection and preservation of forensic evidence. DNA samples were taken, documented, stored. Investigators interviewed potential witnesses, looked for anyone who might have seen something along that stretch of interstate on March 29th. They came up empty. A reward fund was established, eventually reaching $27,000 through a combination of crime solvers' money and private donations. The community wanted answers. Tips came in but led nowhere. The case, like the Lard case before it, went cold. What no one knew at the time was that the two cases were connected. Jackie Lard, 40 years old, married mother of two, killed in Stafford County in November 1986. Amy Baker, 18 years old, recent GED graduate, killed in Fairfax County in March 1989. The crimes had occurred nearly 3 years apart, in different jurisdictions with different types of victims. There was no obvious reason to link them, but the biological evidence told a different story. The DNA samples that had been carefully preserved from both crime scenes shared a common source. The same person who had killed Jackie Lard had also killed Amy Baker. It would just take decades for investigators to be able to see that connection. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, both cases remained open but unsolved. The evidence sat in storage, the files were reviewed periodically by cold case detectives, and the families continued to wait. DNA technology advanced steadily during those years. What had been cutting edge in the mid-80s became routine. Databases were established where DNA profiles could be searched and compared. The DNA from the Lard case was entered into Virginia's state database, and later into the national database maintained by the FBI. Investigators ran searches periodically, hoping for a hit, hoping that somewhere in the system there would be a match to a known offender. But the searches came back negative. Whoever had committed these crimes had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA submission to any database. In 2021, detectives with the Fairfax County Police Department's cold case team made a decision that would prove crucial. They submitted evidence from Amy Baker's case to DNA Labs International for more advanced analysis. New techniques could now extract clearer profiles from old, degraded samples. The lab developed a DNA profile from the evidence and uploaded it to Virginia's state database. When that profile hit the system, something remarkable happened. It matched DNA from another unsolved murder, the killing of Jacqueline Lard in Stafford County, more than 34 years earlier. The cases were connected. The same person had killed both women. This revelation meant that investigators from Stafford County and Fairfax County needed to work together, pooling their resources and evidence. The DNA link suggested they were dealing with someone who had committed at least 2 murders, possibly more. But even with the connection established, they still didn't have a name. The problem was straightforward. The DNA profile didn't match anyone in the criminal databases. The killer, whoever he was, had either never been convicted of a crime requiring DNA submission, or had committed these murders before such databases existed and had simply avoided detection since. Traditional investigative methods had been exhausted decades ago. What investigators needed was a different approach. That approach came in the form of forensic investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that had only recently begun to be used in law enforcement. The method had gained national attention in 2018 when it was used to identify the Golden State Killer, a case that had also remained unsolved for decades. The technique worked by taking DNA from a crime scene and comparing it not to criminal databases but to public genealogy databases where people had voluntarily submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry. Stafford County Detective DK Wood became the driving force behind applying this new technology to the Lard case. Detective Wood had refused to let the case go idle, even decades after the crime. He reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specialized in DNA phenotyping and forensic genetic genealogy. Parabon could take the DNA profile from the crime scenes and use it to build a family tree, identifying not the specific individual but the family that individual belonged to. The work was painstaking. Genealogists at Parabon began uploading the suspect's DNA profile to public genealogy databases, looking for matches to distant relatives. When they found matches, they began the process of building family trees, working forward through generations to identify possible suspects. It was detective work of a different kind, requiring knowledge of genetics, genealogy, and demographics. The Virginia State Police also became involved through their Unsolved Violent Crimes and Cold Cases Analytical Support Team, which had been established with grant funding specifically to help solve cold cases using advanced DNA techniques. Multiple agencies were now working together, bringing different expertise to bear on these decades-old murders. The process took time. Months passed as genealogists worked through family trees, eliminating branches, focusing on individuals who fit the general parameters. The right age, the right geographic location, male. By December 14, 2023, they had narrowed it down to a family name. From there, investigators began the traditional detective work of identifying specific individuals within that family who might be suspects. One name emerged as particularly promising: Elroy Harrison, a 65-year-old resident of Stafford County. He was the right age to have been in his late 20s to early 30s during the time period of the murders. He lived in the area where the crimes had occurred. Investigators began looking into his background. What they found was suggestive. According to news reports from 1983, a man named Elroy Harrison had been arrested for the armed robbery of a Stafford County bank. This indicated a history of violent crime, though investigators would need to confirm that this was the same Elroy Harrison and that the robbery conviction hadn't required DNA submission to databases. Armed with this information, investigators obtained a search warrant for Harrison's DNA. This required presenting evidence to a judge showing probable cause to believe that Harrison's DNA would match the crime scene evidence. The genetic genealogy work, combined with Harrison's geographic proximity and criminal history, was enough to meet that threshold. Detectives approached Harrison and obtained a buccal swab, a simple cheek swab that would provide a sample of his DNA for comparison. The sample was sent to the Virginia Department of Forensic Science for analysis. In February 2024, the results came back. The DNA was a match. After nearly 38 years, investigators finally had a name for the person who had killed Jacqueline Lard. And that same DNA also matched the Amy Baker crime scene. The same person had killed both women. For the investigators who had worked these cases, some for decades, the confirmation was profound. For the families who had waited all those years, it meant that finally, after all that time, someone would be held accountable. On Monday, March 4th, 2024, a Stafford County grand jury met to consider the evidence against Elroy Harrison. They returned indictments on multiple charges: first-degree murder, abduction with the intent to defile, aggravated malicious wounding, and breaking and entering with the intent to commit murder. All charges related to the death of Jacqueline Lard. The next day, Tuesday, March 5th, Stafford County Detective D.K. Wood, the same detective who had pushed for the genetic genealogy analysis, arrested Elroy Harrison at his home in Stafford County. Harrison was 65 years old at the time of his arrest. He was placed in the Rappahannock Regional Jail without bond. The arrest made news across the region. After nearly 4 decades, one of Northern Virginia's most notorious cold cases had finally resulted in an arrest. For Jackie Lard's family, now scattered and aged by the passage of time, the news brought a complicated mixture of relief and renewed grief. Her daughter, who had been 13 when her mother was killed, was now in her 50s. Her son had grown up entirely without his mother. Jackie's parents and sister had all died without seeing justice, a fact that her husband mentioned in later statements. For Amy Baker's family, the news was equally significant. Sue and Mark Baker, now in their 70s, had never given up hope that Amy's killer would be found. Sue told reporters that she had thought she would die before getting answers. When detectives came to inform them of the arrest, the Bakers initially thought it was just another update, another event marking the anniversary of Amy's death. When the detectives told them they had arrested someone, the Bakers described wanting to laugh, to cry, to celebrate, hardly able to believe that after 35 years, justice might finally come. While Harrison had been formally charged only in the Lard case at that point, authorities made clear that they intended to seek charges against him in Amy Baker's death as well. Fairfax County cold case detectives and prosecutors began working on building their case. Harrison was appointed a public defender, attorney Jim Ilajevich. The case presented enormous challenges for the defense. The DNA evidence was compelling, linking Harrison to both crime scenes with statistical certainty that ran into the billions to one. The genetic genealogy work had been done carefully, following established protocols. The traditional police work that followed had been methodical, but the defense would have their opportunity to challenge the evidence. The case moved through the legal system slowly, as complex cases do. There were competency evaluations to determine if Harrison was mentally fit to stand trial. There were mountains of evidence to review, 38 years of investigation reports, thousands of pages of documents, forensic analyses from multiple eras of technology. The defense requested delays to have adequate time to prepare. Harrison's trial in the Lard case was originally scheduled for early 2025, but was delayed to allow more time for preparation. A second attorney, Eugene Frost, was appointed to assist with the defense given the complexity of the case. During pre-trial hearings, the prosecution indicated they wanted to introduce evidence of Harrison's connection to Amy Baker's murder, even though he hadn't been formally charged in that case. The prosecution argued that because the cases were so closely linked, jurors should be allowed to hear about both to understand the full pattern of behavior. The trial finally began on Monday, June 16, 2025, in Stafford Circuit Court. Judge Victoria Willis presided. The trial was expected to last about 2 weeks, and the courtroom gallery included members of both the Lard and Baker families. Sue Baker made a point of attending, wanting to witness justice being done for Jackie Lard and to show support for Jackie's family, knowing that her own family's case might follow. The prosecution's case was presented by Assistant Commonwealth's Attorney Amy Casey. She walked the jury through the events of November 14th and 15th, 1986, describing Jackie's last known moments, the violence of the scene at Mount Vernon Realty, the discovery of her body. She explained how investigators had preserved evidence even when they couldn't fully analyze it, how that evidence had been maintained for decades, and how modern science had finally allowed them to identify Harrison. A significant portion of the trial involved what Casey had warned would be tedious but necessary: chain of custody evidence. To use DNA evidence collected in 1986 in a trial in 2025, the prosecution had to prove that the evidence had been properly handled at every step, that it hadn't been contaminated or tampered with, that the samples tested in 2023 and 24 were genuinely from the 1986 crime scene. This meant calling witnesses who had collected evidence, stored evidence, transferred evidence, tested evidence, over a span of nearly 4 decades. It was methodical, detailed work. The DNA evidence itself was explained by expert witnesses who walked the jury through how genetic genealogy worked, how the database matching had been conducted, how Harrison's family had been identified, and finally how Harrison's own DNA had been compared to the crime scene samples. The statistics were overwhelming. The probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than Harrison was essentially zero. The prosecution also presented evidence from Jackie's car, which had been found in Fairfax County weeks after her death. Blood in the car matched Jackie, but there was also a hair found in the vehicle. Testing determined that this hair had come from Harrison. This placed him not just at the crime scene but also in Jackie's vehicle after her abduction. The defense's strategy, as outlined by Attorney Ilajevich in his opening statement, focused on raising doubt about whether the evidence proved that Harrison was the only person who could have committed the crime. He pointed out that other hairs had been found that didn't belong to either Harrison or Lard, suggesting that other unknown individuals might have been present. He questioned aspects of the forensic analysis, particularly noting that biological evidence found on Jackie's clothing was not located where one might expect if the crime had unfolded exactly as prosecutors described. The defense faced an uphill battle. The DNA evidence was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, and DNA evidence has become almost unassailable in modern courtrooms when properly handled and analyzed. But Ilajevich did his job, raising questions, pointing out gaps, and ensuring that Harrison received a vigorous defense. Throughout the trial, witnesses testified about Jackie as a person, not just as a victim. Her work colleagues, investigators who had known the family, people who had tried for decades to solve this case. The portrait that emerged was of an ordinary woman living an ordinary life who had encountered something terrible through no fault of her own. When detectives had confronted Harrison after obtaining the DNA match, he had reportedly said something chilling when asked why he had done these things and what had happened when he was young. According to testimony, Harrison replied that he would take the death penalty. It wasn't a confession, but it was a statement that prosecutors suggested showed consciousness of guilt. The trial continued through its second week. The evidence piled up day after day. And then, on Thursday, June 27, 2025, the jury reached its verdict. They found Elroy Harrison guilty on all counts, though they convicted him of second-degree murder rather than first-degree. This meant the jury believed Harrison had killed Jackie Lard intentionally but not with premeditation. The distinction matters legally in terms of sentencing, but the guilty verdict on second-degree murder still carried the possibility of life in prison. He was also convicted of abduction with intent to defile, rape, aggravated malicious wounding, and breaking and entering with intent to commit murder, rape, or robbery. In the courtroom, there were tears. Jackie's daughter, now in her 50s, attended the trial and would later speak at sentencing about how her mother's murder had broken her. Jackie's husband, a DEA agent who had spent 38 years without answers, sat through the trial watching the man who had killed his wife be held accountable. Sentencing was scheduled for October, several months later, to allow for the preparation of pre-sentencing reports and victim impact statements. On Friday, October 11th, 2025, Elroy Harrison, now 67 years old, appeared before Judge Victoria Willis for sentencing in the murder of Jacqueline Lard. The courtroom was again filled with family members, investigators, and community members who had followed this case for decades. Jackie's daughter addressed the court. She spoke about being 13 years old when her mother was murdered, about growing up without her mother's guidance, about the ways her mother's violent death had shaped and broken her. She talked about missed milestones, about graduations and weddings and grandchildren that her mother never got to see. Her statement was raw and powerful, a reminder that the effects of murder ripple outward and forward in time. Jackie's husband spoke as well. He noted that his wife's parents and her sister had all died without seeing justice, that they had carried the pain of Jackie's unsolved murder to their graves. He described nearly 4 decades of waiting, hoping, and wondering if the person who had killed his wife would ever be identified. Members of Amy Baker's family were also present, a show of solidarity and shared experience. They understood what Jackie's family had endured because they had endured it themselves. and they waited for their own case to move forward. Judge Willis listened to all the statements, reviewed all the evidence, and then imposed sentence. She called Harrison's crime evil, a word that judges don't use lightly. She sentenced him to 3 life terms plus 40 years in prison. Given Harrison's age, the sentence was effectively a guarantee that he would die in prison. Assistant Commonwealth's Attorney Sarah Watkins expressed gratitude for the sentence, stating that it was appropriate given the gravity of the crime and the length of time it had taken to achieve justice for Jackie and her family. The families, while nothing could bring Jackie back, could at least have the certainty that her killer would never walk free again. But the story wasn't entirely finished. Harrison had not yet been formally charged in Amy Baker's case. Fairfax County prosecutors were still building their case, working with the same DNA evidence and genetic genealogy analysis that had led to Harrison's conviction in the Lard case. The evidence clearly linked Harrison to Amy's murder, but Fairfax County wanted to ensure their case was as strong as possible before proceeding. For Sue and Mark Baker, the wait continued, though now with the knowledge that Harrison was already in prison and would remain there. They wanted formal charges in Amy's case, wanted a trial where Amy's murder would be addressed directly, where her life would be remembered and her death formally acknowledged in a courtroom. They wanted the same closure that Jackie's family had finally received. The Fairfax County Police Department issued statements indicating that charges were expected in the Baker case, but as of late 2025, no trial date had been set. The wheels of justice, having moved so slowly for so long, continued their deliberate pace. Investigators who had worked these cases over the decades reflected on what the resolution meant. Detective D.K. Wood, who had pushed for the genetic genealogy analysis that broke the case open, had seen his determination rewarded. The Stafford County Sheriff's Office, which had maintained evidence from 1986 through multiple generations of leadership and investigators, had demonstrated why it's crucial never to discard evidence from unsolved cases, even when technology seems unable to answer the questions that evidence might pose. The case raised larger questions about how many other cold cases might be solvable with these new techniques. Genetic genealogy had proven its value in high-profile cases like the Golden State Killer, and now it was showing its utility in lesser-known but no less important cases like the murders of Jacqueline Lard and Amy Baker. Investigators around the country began looking at their own cold cases with fresh eyes, wondering what cases might benefit from this approach. But the technique also raised privacy concerns that continue to be debated. When people submit their DNA to commercial genealogy companies to learn about their ancestry, are they consenting to their genetic information being used to investigate their relatives? The databases used in these investigations are generally those where people have voluntarily made their information available for law enforcement purposes. But the ethical questions remain complex. From a purely investigative standpoint, however, the technique had proven remarkably effective. It had given families answers after decades of silence. It had identified a killer who had evaded detection through traditional means. And it had demonstrated that time alone doesn't grant immunity from justice. There's something profound about evidence waiting decades to speak. The biological samples collected in 1986 didn't decay into uselessness. The investigators who carefully preserved that evidence couldn't have known that nearly 40 years would pass before it yielded a name. but they preserved it anyway, believing that science might someday catch up. Their diligence mattered. The story of Jacqueline Lard and Amy Baker is also a reminder of randomness, of how violence can intrude into ordinary moments without warning or logic. Jackie was at work, doing her job, closing up an office. Amy was driving home after visiting family, ran out of gas, and got out of her car to seek help. Neither woman did anything wrong. Neither woman invited danger. They were simply in the wrong place when the wrong person crossed their path. Elroy Harrison had lived in Stafford County throughout the decades following these murders. He lived an apparently ordinary life while two families grieved, while investigators worked thousands of hours trying to solve these crimes, while evidence sat in storage waiting to be understood. According to reports, aside from the 1983 bank robbery, he had no significant criminal record in recent years. He was, by most outward appearances, just another resident of the community. This is perhaps one of the most unsettling aspects of such cases. The ability of some people to commit terrible violence and then return to everyday life, living among others without detection. Harrison went to work, paid bills, interacted with neighbors, all while carrying the knowledge of what he had done. The psychological dimension of that, the capacity to live with such acts, remains one of the most difficult aspects of violent crime to understand. The question of why Harrison killed these women may never be fully answered. During his interrogation, when asked what had happened when he was young, his response about accepting the death penalty suggested that he himself saw something broken or wrong in his own history, but he offered no detailed explanation. Some questions don't have satisfying answers. Sometimes the motivation behind violence remains opaque even after the perpetrator is identified and convicted. What we're left with are the facts. 2 women killed, 2 families devastated, decades of uncertainty, and finally, through the patient work of investigators and the advancement of science, a resolution. It's not the kind of closure that makes everything better. Nothing can undo the murders or restore the lost decades, but it provides what justice can provide: accountability, acknowledgement, and an end to the uncertainty. For families of victims in unsolved cases, that uncertainty is its own particular torture. Not knowing creates a space where imagination runs wild, where every possibility must be considered, where hope and despair coexist in uncomfortable tension. The resolution of a case, even one that took decades, provides a different kind of finality. The questions have answers, even if those answers are painful. As of late 2025, Elroy Harrison sits in a Virginia prison, serving his multiple life sentences. He is 67 years old. He will likely die in prison. The Stafford County case is closed. The Fairfax County case awaits its own legal resolution, though the essential work of identifying the killer is done. Jackie Lard's children have lived more of their lives without their mother than with her. They were 13 and 7 when she died. They're now in their 50s and 40s. Amy Baker never got the chance to grow into adulthood, to discover who she might become, to live the life that should have been hers. These are the permanent losses that no amount of justice can repair. But the story also demonstrates something important about persistence, about refusing to accept that some questions will never be answered. Detective Wood didn't have to pursue genetic genealogy. The case was cold, had been cold for decades. It would have been understandable to focus resources on newer cases with fresher leads. But he pushed forward anyway. The Stafford County Sheriff's Office didn't have to maintain evidence from 1986 with such care. They could have disposed of it at some point, declared the case unsolvable. But they kept it, and the families didn't give up hope. After 3 decades, after 4 decades, they continued to believe that someday, somehow, there would be answers. Their persistence kept pressure on investigators, kept these cases in the public consciousness, prevented them from being entirely forgotten. In the end, this is a story about time and how it does and doesn't heal wounds. The passage of nearly 40 years didn't make these murders any less significant or any less worth solving. If anything, the duration made the resolution more meaningful. After waiting so long, the families and investigators could finally say that they knew, that they had answers, that someone had been held accountable. The woods where Jackie's body was found and where Amy's body was found are still there, though perhaps developed or changed in the decades since. Life continues in Stafford County and Fairfax County. People go to work, raise families, live their lives, mostly unaware of the violence that once touched these places. That's as it should be. Communities can't exist in perpetual mourning. But somewhere in those communities, there are people who remember. Jackie's children remember their mother. Amy's parents remember their daughter. Investigators remember the cases they couldn't solve until technology caught up to their determination. And now there's a resolution to remember too. A demonstration that justice, even long delayed, remains possible. If there's a lesson in this story beyond the specific facts of these murders, it might be about the importance of not accepting that some wrongs can't be righted. Technology advances. Techniques improve. Evidence that seems meaningless today might speak volumes tomorrow. The work of justice requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to believe that answers exist even when they remain hidden. As we close this story, we're left with two women who should still be alive, who should have lived full lives, who deserved so much better than what happened to them. We're left with families who endured decades of uncertainty and pain. And we're left with the knowledge that sometimes, eventually, the truth emerges from the darkness where it's been hiding. The cases of Jacqueline Lard and Amy Baker remind us that every unsolved case represents real people, real loss, real families waiting for answers. Behind every cold case file is a story like this one. Ordinary lives interrupted by violence, families forever changed, and investigators who refuse to give up. Time passes, but some stories demand to be told. Some wrongs demand to be addressed. And some questions demand answers, no matter how long it takes to find them. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 3. The Lewis-Clark Valley Murders. Somewhere between when a 12-year-old girl hung up the phone with her mother and the 5 blocks she needed to walk home, she vanished. Her white bicycle, with its distinctive wing nuts on the front wheels, disappeared with her. That was 1979. By 1982, more people would be gone, and a community along the Snake River would come to understand that something terrible lived among them. Close your eyes and settle in. What you're about to hear is a true story, one that unfolded in a place where people left their doors unlocked and children roamed freely during summer fairs. The Lewis-Clark Valley, where Idaho and Washington meet at the confluence of 2 rivers, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Small towns connected by winding highways, mountains rising in the distance, water cutting through ancient rock. This is the story of 5 people who disappeared between 1979 and 1982. 3 of them were found dead. 2 were never found at all. What makes this case particularly haunting isn't just the tragedy itself, but the fact that investigators believe they know who did it. They've believed it for decades. Yet no arrest has ever been made, no charges filed, no trial held. The story begins on a warm spring day at a county fair, and it ends with questions that still echo through those river valleys today. This is a story about the distance between suspicion and proof, about how someone can live among us while carrying secrets we can only imagine. Let's go back to where it all began. The Lewiston-Clarkston Valley sits at the bottom of a geographical peculiarity, a place where rivers meet and state lines blur. Lewiston, Idaho, and Clarkston, Washington, are twin cities separated by a bridge over the Snake River. The valley itself is carved deep into the landscape, surrounded by steep hills covered in golden grass. In the late 1970s, about 30,000 people called this area home. These were agricultural communities, places where wheat grew on the plateaus above and where the pace of life moved slowly enough that people still measured time by seasons and harvests. Children played outside until dark. Neighbors helped neighbors. The Escalation County Fair, held every spring, was the kind of event that drew everyone for miles around. April 28, 1979, was exactly that kind of day. The fair had rolled into Escalation, Washington, a town of about 1,100 people perched above the Snake River. 12-year-old Christina Lee White, who went by Chrissy, spent the morning watching the parade that kicked off the festivities. She had plans to help a friend with a horse up at the fairgrounds. It was warm that day, unseasonably warm, and Chrissy had suffered from heat stroke before. By early afternoon, she wasn't feeling well. She rode her bicycle, a white 10-speed Schwinn that her father had given her for her birthday just 8 weeks earlier, to a friend's house on 2nd Street. The bike was distinctive, with a basket in front and unusual wing nuts, about 3 inches wide, on the front wheels. From that house, around 2:30 in the afternoon, Chrissy called her mother. Her mother, Betty, couldn't come pick her up. She didn't have access to a car at that moment. She told Chrissy to cool down with a wet washcloth, rest a bit, and then walk the 5 blocks to a street corner where Betty would be watching for her from their home, just 2 blocks further up. It was a reasonable plan for a small town in 1979. Chrissy would walk to the corner, her mother would see her coming, and she'd be home safe. Chrissy never made it to that corner. Somewhere in those 5 blocks, sometime in the minutes or perhaps hours after that phone call, Christina White disappeared. When she didn't call back and didn't appear at the meeting spot, Betty assumed her daughter had felt better and returned to the fair with her friends. It wasn't until later, when Chrissy didn't come home for dinner, that anyone realized something was wrong. The search began that night. Her father suspected the carnival workers, those transient people who came through town with the fair. The sheriff was out of town that weekend, and when he returned, he treated Chrissy's disappearance as a runaway case. Even with that assessment, the search was less thorough than the family hoped. The carnival moved on, taking with it whatever secrets it might have held. Weeks later, pieces of Chrissy's schoolwork were found scattered in a field outside of Escalation, but Chrissy herself and that distinctive white bicycle were never found. The case went cold, filed away as an unfortunate mystery, the kind of thing people whispered about but gradually stopped discussing as months became years. Life in the valley continued. The Snake River kept flowing. The wheat kept growing on the plateaus above. Children kept playing outside, though perhaps parents watched them a bit more carefully now. And then, 2 years later, something happened that would eventually connect back to that spring day when Chrissy White vanished. June 26, 1981. 22-year-old Kristen David was a senior at the University of Idaho in Moscow, studying broadcast journalism and political science. She was athletic, adventurous, the kind of person who thought nothing of riding her bicycle 32 miles from Moscow to Lewiston along Highway 95. The route follows the Palouse River Valley for part of the way, cutting through rolling hills covered in wheat fields before descending toward the confluence of rivers. Kristen was making that ride to visit her family and to start a new job. She left Moscow on her blue 10-speed bicycle, wearing summer clothes, carrying nothing that would slow her down. Multiple people saw her along the way. She stopped at a gas station. People remembered her passing through. And then, somewhere between Genesee and Lewiston, somewhere along that highway with its long views and sparse traffic, Kristen David disappeared. Her family reported her missing when she didn't arrive home. Search parties combed the route. On July 4th, 8 days after Kristen vanished, a fisherman found something in the Snake River about 6 miles west of Clarkston, just west of a place called Silket Island. What he found were black plastic garbage bags. Inside those bags were pieces of Kristen David's body. She had been dismembered. Some of her remains were wrapped in pages from local newspapers, editions from April 1981. The following day, more remains were found further down the river. Kristen's bicycle and personal belongings were never recovered. The Idaho State Police took the lead on the investigation. The FBI issued bulletins. Witnesses came forward with descriptions of a stocky white man in his 30s driving a brown van, someone who had been approaching female cyclists on Highway 95 that same day. Several people reported seeing this man, seeing him stop to talk to women on bicycles, seeing him behave in ways that seemed off somehow. But descriptions aren't enough without a name to attach them to. The investigation continued. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people. They followed leads that went nowhere, pursued suspects who were cleared, built timelines that revealed gaps they couldn't fill. And here's where the pattern becomes visible, though it would take time for investigators to see it clearly. Kristen David had worked at the Lewiston Civic Theater. It was a connection that seemed minor at first, just another detail in the tapestry of her life. The theater was a community institution, a place where people gathered for performances and where volunteers helped with sets and lighting and all the small tasks that make shows possible. By late 1981, investigators began noting similarities between Kristen's murder and Chrissy White's disappearance. Both were young. Both were on bicycles. Both vanished from areas connected to the same community. The cases were officially distinct, but unofficially people began to wonder. The Snake River kept flowing. The valley kept living. And in Lewiston, at that civic theater where Kristen David had once worked, where community members gathered to create art and entertainment, preparations were underway for another season of shows. The building sat in downtown Lewiston, a space that had seen decades of performances, where the green room smelled of old costumes and the stage floor bore the scuff marks of countless productions. The people who worked there, who volunteered there, who built sets and operated lights and performed on that stage, thought of it as a safe space, community space, a place where creativity flourished and where friendships formed over shared labor and shared purpose. On the evening of September 12, 1982, 3 people connected to that theater disappeared. Not 1, 3, all in the same night, all from locations within blocks of each other, all gone without a trace. And with those disappearances, the Lewis-Clark Valley murders would finally reveal themselves as something more than isolated incidents. They were connected. They had always been connected. And the person responsible had been moving through this community, seen but not recognized, present but not suspected, for at least 3 years. September 12, 1982, started as an ordinary evening in Lewiston. The weather was mild, transitioning from summer into fall. 21-year-old Christina Nelson and her 18-year-old stepsister Jacqueline Miller, who went by Brandy, decided to walk from Nelson's apartment to a grocery store in downtown Lewiston. It was a short walk, just a few blocks through a residential area. They left the apartment around 8:30 in the evening. Christina and Brandy were close, the kind of sisters who spent time together by choice rather than obligation. Christina had worked as a janitor at the Lewiston Civic Theater before quitting. Brandy was younger, still finding her way in the world. They were walking to buy groceries, an errand so mundane that neither of them mentioned to anyone exactly where they were going or when they'd be back. They never returned. Their route would have taken them past the Lewiston Civic Theater. That's important to remember. The theater sat on their path, a building they both knew well, a place where Christina had worked and where both had spent time. Whether they stopped there, whether they went inside, whether they even paused to look at it as they walked past, we'll never know for certain. That same evening, 35-year-old Stephen Pearsall was at the theater. Stephen was a gentle person, someone people described as kind and helpful. He had taken over Christina's position as janitor at the theater after she quit. He was also an amateur musician who played the clarinet, and he'd gone to the theater that night with plans to practice his instrument and do some laundry. Friends had given Stephen a ride to the theater earlier in the evening and dropped him off. He told them he'd find his own way home, that he had things to take care of at the theater. Stephen had a big brother relationship with both Christina and Brandy. They lived just blocks from his apartment. He knew them well, cared about them, looked out for them. Stephen Pearsall never came home that night either. The next morning, when Stephen's friends realized he hadn't returned to his apartment, they went to check on him. His car was still parked at a friend's house where he'd left it. Inside his apartment, they found his clarinet, an instrument he treasured and would never have left behind intentionally. They also found an uncashed paycheck, money Stephen needed and would have been eager to deposit. When Christina and Brandy didn't return to the apartment they shared, their family grew concerned as well. These were not people who disappeared on whims or failed to communicate. They were responsible, predictable, the kind of people who called if they were going to be late. The investigation began immediately. Police canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed anyone who might have seen the women walking toward the store. They examined the theater, looking for signs of struggle, evidence of what might have happened there. What they found was both everything and nothing. At the theater that night, another person had been present. Lance Voss was his name, and he'd been working on set construction for an upcoming production. Voss told investigators he'd been at the theater earlier in the evening but had left to get pizza. He said he returned around 10 o'clock in the evening, but by then he wasn't feeling well. He had some kind of injury, the nature of which wasn't publicly specified, and he'd laid down on a sofa in the green room to rest. According to Voss, he fell asleep on that sofa and didn't wake until 4 in the morning. He slept through the entire night, he claimed, despite the fact that the theater had a heavy door that made noise when it opened and closed. He heard nothing, saw nothing, knew nothing about 3 people who had disappeared, possibly from that very building, while he slept. The investigation into those triple disappearances expanded rapidly. This wasn't a single person vanishing anymore. 3 people gone in one night suggested something organized, something planned, something that required either multiple perpetrators or one person with preparation and opportunity. Detectives looked hard at Stephen Pearsall initially. Could he have been involved in the women's disappearance? The timeline made it possible. He was at the theater. They might have gone there. But as the investigation progressed, that theory fell apart. Stephen's behavior before that night didn't suggest violence or capacity for harm. He'd left valuables behind, including his cherished clarinet and needed money. His car was where he'd left it. Nothing about Stephen suggested he'd planned to disappear or that he'd been involved in something criminal. The working theory became darker. Stephen Pearsall was probably in the wrong place at the wrong time. He may have witnessed something, seen something, known something that made him a liability. Christina and Brandy might have walked past the theater, might have gone inside because Christina knew the space well, might have encountered something terrible. And Stephen, who cared about them like a brother, might have tried to help or might simply have been there when he shouldn't have been. Months passed. The 3 remained missing. Searches covered miles of terrain around Lewiston. The Snake River was examined again. Fields were walked. Abandoned buildings were checked. Nothing emerged except more questions. And then, on March 19, 1984, a hunter found something in a rural area about 35 miles from Lewiston, near the small community of Kendrick. Hidden in rough terrain, partially concealed by vegetation and time, were human remains. Dental records confirmed the identities. Christina Nelson and Brandy Miller had been found. Their bodies showed signs of having been there for a long time, exposed to weather and wildlife. Investigators determined that Brandy had been murdered, though the specific cause of death wasn't released to the public. For Christina, the condition of her remains made determining cause of death impossible. Stephen Pearsall was not with them. His body has never been found. To this day, more than 4 decades later, Stephen Pearsall remains officially missing, though everyone involved believes he's dead, a victim of the same person who killed Christina and Brandy. With these discoveries and the passage of time, investigators began connecting cases more formally. Chrissy White's disappearance in 1979, Kristen David's murder in 1981, the triple disappearance and double murder in 1982. Different victims, different circumstances, different methods perhaps, but common threads kept emerging. Young people, vulnerable moments, connections to the same geographic area, and one name that kept appearing in the margins of multiple investigations. Lance Voss had lived in a house in Asotin very close to where Chrissy White made her last phone call in 1979. More specifically, the house where Chrissy called her mother from was owned by a woman Voss was dating at the time, a woman who would later become his wife. Voss had been at the Lewiston Civic Theater the night Christina Nelson, Brandy Miller, and Stephen Pearsall disappeared. Kristen David had also worked at that theater, and Voss had worked there too. The connections weren't proof. They were proximity. But proximity, again and again, to the exact places where people vanished, starts to look like more than coincidence. Investigators interviewed Voss multiple times over the years. He provided alibis. He explained his presence. He offered theories about what might have happened. He was cooperative, at least superficially, but each conversation seemed to raise as many questions as it answered. Other suspects emerged and were investigated. In 1984, serial killer Otis Toole, who was in custody for other crimes, implicated himself in Kristen David's murder. Idaho State Police called him their strongest suspect. But Toole confessed to many crimes he didn't commit, and by 2009, a retired Lewiston detective who had interviewed Toole stated definitively that he'd been ruled out. The Robert Lee Yates case brought investigators back to Voss in 1998. Yates was a confirmed serial killer operating in nearby Spokane, and when authorities investigated his crimes, they looked at whether he might be connected to the Lewis-Clark Valley murders. Part of that investigation included interviewing Voss again. The Yates connection didn't pan out, but the renewed attention on Voss reinforced what many investigators already believed. By 1995, Lewiston police announced publicly that they believed Christina Nelson, Brandy Miller, and Stephen Pearsall had been murdered together, likely inside or very near the Lewiston Civic Theater, probably by someone who worked there. That unnamed suspect, they noted, had also lived in the house from which Chrissy White disappeared in 1979. They didn't say Voss's name in official statements, but the community knew who they meant. The documentaries that would later examine these cases, the investigative journalists who dug into the files, the families who sought answers, all pointed to the same person. Who was Lance Jeffrey Voss? That's the question that haunts this case almost as much as the disappearances themselves. To understand why he became the primary suspect, we need to look at his life, his patterns, his history. Voss was born in Chicago in 1945. He served in the Navy from 1965 to 1968 during the Vietnam era. His service took him to various ports, ships docking in Hawaii, Hong Kong, California, and Washington. After his discharge in 1968, he settled in California for a time, moving around the Bay Area, working various jobs including used car sales, which would have given him access to different vehicles. In 1972, something happened that appears significant in retrospect. Voss was arrested in San Jose, California, for attempting to break into a mortuary. Police found him there at night with a flashlight, a knife, and a camera. Inside the mortuary was the body of a young woman. Voss was 25 years old at the time. The arrest didn't lead to major charges, but it's the kind of incident that makes investigators look twice when similar patterns emerge later. There was also the case of a 17-year-old girl in California who disappeared in June 1972 after an argument with her boyfriend on a beach. Her nude body was found floating in the water the next day. The area where this happened was one where Voss had connections. He was never charged, never officially connected, but investigators would later note the timing and location. By the late 1970s, Voss had moved to the Lewis-Clark Valley. He worked various jobs, including at the Lewiston Civic Theater where he helped build sets. He was involved in local theater productions, sometimes acting, more often working behind the scenes. People who knew him described him as tall, about 6 feet 4 inches, imposing in stature. Some found him friendly and helpful. Others found him odd, eccentric, slightly off in ways they couldn't quite articulate. When Chrissy White disappeared in April 1979, Voss was dating a woman named Patricia who owned the house on 2nd Street where Chrissy made her last phone call. Voss effectively lived there at the time. After Chrissy vanished, Voss participated in the search efforts. Multiple people remembered him showing up to help, wearing a wet towel around his neck despite the cool temperatures, suggesting search areas that diverted attention from the primary zones where searchers were focusing. Years later, when investigators looked back, they found this behavior suspicious. Why would someone have a wet towel around their neck when it wasn't particularly hot? Why would they suggest searching in areas that led people away from the most logical locations? These questions don't prove anything, but they create unease. When Kristen David was murdered in June 1981, Voss worked at the same theater where she had worked. He drove routes that took him along Highway 95, where she disappeared. Investigators noted that Voss owned tools consistent with the type of dismemberment performed on Kristen's body, though many people own such tools without being murderers. The night of September 12, 1982, Voss admits to being at the Lewiston Civic Theater when Christina Nelson, Brandy Miller, and Stephen Pearsall vanished. His account is that he left to get pizza, came back, felt unwell, and slept on a sofa in the green room from 10 at night until 4 in the morning. He claims he heard nothing during the critical hours when 3 people disappeared, possibly from that very building. The theater had a heavy door. It made noise. How would someone sleep through entries and exits? How would someone sleep through a struggle if one occurred? How would someone sleep through whatever happened that night that caused 3 people to vanish completely? Investigators found his story difficult to believe, but inability to believe isn't evidence of guilt. They looked for physical evidence connecting Voss to the crimes. They tested what DNA was available using the limited technology of the 1980s. Nothing definitively linked him. Over the years, Voss was interviewed repeatedly. A Lewiston police officer recalled years later how Voss had approached him on the street one day and casually asked about the progress of the serial killer investigation. The officer found the encounter odd, unsettling in a way he couldn't fully explain. Why would someone approach a police officer to ask about an ongoing murder investigation in such a casual manner? Family members of victims remembered Voss showing up at community events, at vigils, at gatherings where people came together to support one another. His presence felt wrong to some of them, though they couldn't say precisely why. He was always helpful, always offering assistance, always seeming to be interested in the cases. There's a phenomenon in criminal psychology where perpetrators insert themselves into investigations. They volunteer to help search for bodies. They attend vigils. They talk to police. They engage with the community around their crimes because it gives them access to information, allows them to gauge how close investigators are getting, and provides a kind of psychological satisfaction. Voss's pattern of behavior fits that profile. But fitting a profile isn't proof of guilt. In the 1990s, as DNA technology advanced, investigators hoped new tests might break the case open. Some testing was done, though the details remain largely confidential. According to some accounts, Voss's stepson indicated that DNA tests had been conducted related to another case in which Voss was a person of interest, and those tests had cleared him. However, family members have stated that the DNA evidence was legally restricted from being used in the Lewis-Clark Valley cases and was later destroyed. This raises thorny questions about evidence handling, about what can and cannot be used across different investigations, about the frustrations that occur when technological advances come too late or legal restrictions prevent their application. In 1998, Spokane authorities investigating the Robert Lee Yates case interviewed Voss again. Yates was ultimately convicted of killing 13 women, but he wasn't connected to the Lewis-Clark Valley murders. The interview with Voss during that investigation yielded nothing actionable. In 2011, a documentary called Confluence was released, examining the Lewis-Clark Valley murders in detail. The documentary never named Voss directly, but it identified him through the careful presentation of facts. His connections to the victims, his presence at key locations, his involvement with the Civic Theater. For anyone paying attention, the identity of the primary suspect became clear. In 2018, Investigation Discovery aired a 2-part series called Cold Valley, which examined the cases even more thoroughly. Asotin County Detective Jackie Nichols, who had taken over the investigation, appeared in the program and reaffirmed the connections between the cases. She made it clear that investigators believed the same person was responsible for all the disappearances and murders. Throughout all of this, Lance Voss was never charged. He moved to the East Coast in the late 1990s. He died sometime in the 2010s. The exact date of his death isn't widely publicized, but multiple sources confirm he died without ever being formally accused, arrested, or tried for the Lewis-Clark Valley murders. Detective Jackie Nichols of the Asotin County Sheriff's Office keeps a picture of Christina White on a corkboard in her office. It's a reminder, she says, that cold cases shouldn't be forgotten. Nichols has spent years working these cases, often on her own time because her current caseload doesn't allow for dedicated attention to investigations from decades ago. She's searched fields with ground-penetrating radar. She's excavated sites where Voss lived or worked. She's interviewed anyone willing to talk about the cases. She's worked with psychics, not because she necessarily believes in such things, but because she's determined to explore every possibility, no matter how unlikely. I start thinking, well, what can I do? What other avenues haven't we gone down? What can we explore? She said in an interview. At night, when she lies down to rest, her mind keeps working on the cases, turning over details, looking for connections she might have missed. The families of the victims have lived with absence for more than 4 decades now. Chrissy White's mother, Betty, passed away without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. Stephen Pearsall's sister, Rhonda Albright, has spoken about the heartbreak, about seeing her father broken by the loss of his son, about the devastation that never fully heals when someone you love disappears without explanation. The community has long memories. People in the Lewis-Clark Valley still talk about the murders, still wonder, still feel uneasy when they think about the years between 1979 and 1982. Some people who lived through that time say they remember being more cautious, watching their children more carefully, feeling that something dark had settled over their valley. The legal reality is stark. Lance Voss is dead. Even if new evidence emerged tomorrow that definitively proved his guilt, there would be no trial, no conviction, no formal acknowledgement of his crimes. The closest thing to justice at this point would be certainty, the ability to tell families that their suspicions were correct, that the person responsible has been identified beyond doubt. But suspicion isn't the same as proof. Everything investigators know about Voss, all the connections and coincidences and patterns, might create a compelling narrative without constituting legal evidence sufficient for prosecution. That's the frustration that echoes through this case. Advances in forensic technology offer some hope. Familial DNA searching, where investigators use genetic databases to identify relatives of unknown perpetrators, has solved cold cases that seemed impossible. If biological evidence from the crime scene still exists and is in good condition, it might be possible to extract DNA and run it through genealogical databases. Detective Nichols has spoken about this possibility. She's hopeful that technology will continue to advance, that new techniques will emerge, that something will break open the cases she's devoted so much of her life to solving. In July 2024, the Crime Junkie podcast devoted an episode to the Lewis-Clark Valley murders, bringing renewed attention to the cases. The FBI has indicated they remain in close contact with Detective Nichols, particularly regarding Christina White's disappearance. They haven't ruled out the possibility that her case is linked to the others, and they continue to hold out hope that advances in investigative techniques might provide answers. The Snake River continues to flow through that valley where Idaho and Washington meet. The theater in Lewiston still stands, still hosts productions, still brings the community together for art and entertainment. The streets of Asotin where Chrissy White walked that April day look different now, but the geography is the same. The fairgrounds still host events every spring. People who visit these places today have no way of knowing, unless they're told, about the history those locations carry. That's how it is with crime. It leaves marks that are invisible to most people, scars that only the directly affected can feel. There are theories about why Lance Voss, if he was indeed responsible, was never charged. Some point to the lack of physical evidence linking him directly to the crimes. Others note the complexity of proving cases that rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. Still others wonder if mistakes were made early in the investigations, before anyone realized the cases were connected, mistakes that compromised evidence or allowed crucial time to pass. Stephen Pearsall's continued absence complicates everything. Without his body, without confirmation of his death, there's always a sliver of doubt. Could he have been involved somehow? Could he have left voluntarily? The evidence suggests not. His behavior before that night, his relationships with the people around him, the possessions he left behind, all point toward him being a victim rather than a perpetrator. But as long as he's officially missing, that thread of doubt remains. The documentary Confluence explored an interesting angle, the possibility that Voss might have been involved in other crimes beyond the Lewis-Clark Valley. His time in California, his movements around the country, the 1972 mortuary incident, all raise questions about whether these 5 cases represent the entirety of his criminal history or just a portion of it. Some investigators and researchers have speculated about connections to unsolved cases in other regions where Voss lived or traveled. These remain speculative, threads that haven't been pulled firmly enough to prove anything, but the questions linger. What we're left with is a case that remains technically open but practically closed. The primary suspect is dead. The investigations have been thorough. The families have waited for decades. The community has moved forward while carrying the weight of what happened. If you visit the Lewis-Clark Valley today, you'll find a beautiful place. The rivers are stunning. The hills turn gold in summer and green in winter. The small towns have the kind of character that comes from history and resilience. But if you talk to people who remember the late 70s and early 80s, who lived through those years when children disappeared and bodies were found, you'll hear a different kind of story. They'll tell you about fear that settled over the community, about parents who started keeping their children closer, about the understanding that evil doesn't always announce itself, that sometimes it lives next door or works alongside you or shows up to help search for the very people it has harmed. They'll tell you about Lance Voss, about the man who was always present, always helpful, always interested in cases that seemed to orbit around him. They'll tell you about suspicions that could never quite become accusations, about evidence that existed but didn't cohere into proof, about the frustration of knowing without being able to prove. And they'll tell you about the victims. Chrissy White, 12 years old, who loved her new bicycle and never got to grow up. Kristen David, 22, studying to become a journalist, whose life ended along a highway between towns. Christina Nelson and Brandy Miller, sisters by choice, who went to buy groceries and never came home. Stephen Pearsall, a gentle soul who played the clarinet and looked after people he cared about, whose body has never been found. 5 people, more than 40 years, no arrests, no trial, no conviction. The case files remain open. Detective Nichols continues her work. The families continue to wait for something they may never receive. And somewhere in those files, in the careful documentation of decades of investigation, lies the detailed story of Lance Jeffrey Voss, a man who died without ever being formally accused but who investigators believe carried terrible secrets to his grave. This is the nature of some true crime stories. They don't end with satisfying conclusions or dramatic courtroom moments. They end with questions, with families who have learned to live with uncertainty, with communities that remember and wonder, with investigators who refuse to give up even when the central figure has passed beyond the reach of earthly justice. The Snake River keeps flowing. The valley keeps living. The cases remain open, waiting for that piece of evidence, that breakthrough in technology, that witness who finally comes forward, whatever it might be that could finally provide the answers that have been sought for so many years. And in her office in Asotin County, Detective Nichols keeps that picture of Christina White on her corkboard. A reminder, promise, a refusal to let these cases be forgotten. Because somewhere in those 5 blocks between a phone call and a corner where a mother waited, in those miles along Highway 95 where a young woman on a bicycle vanished, in that theater where 3 people disappeared in a single night, something terrible happened. Someone made choices that destroyed lives and fractured families and left scars that still haven't healed. We may never know every detail. We may never have the kind of closure that comes from a verdict and a sentence. But we can remember. We can tell the stories of the people who were lost. We can honor the tireless work of investigators who refuse to give up. And we can understand that justice, while sometimes delayed or incomplete, remains something worth pursuing, even when decades have passed and the person responsible has gone beyond the reach of any earthly court. The Lewis-Clark Valley murders remain unsolved. But they are not forgotten. And as long as people like Detective Jackie Nichols keep working, as long as families keep hoping, as long as technology keeps advancing, there remains the possibility that one day, the full truth will finally emerge from the shadows where it has hidden for so long. Until then, we're left with a story that is both complete and incomplete, a narrative that has all the facts but lacks the final resolution, a case that everyone believes they understand but no one can quite prove. That's the story of the Lewis-Clark Valley murders. A story of loss and absence, of suspicion without proof, of questions that may never be fully answered. But also a story of persistence, of communities that remember, of investigators who refuse to give up, of families who continue to seek truth even when truth seems impossibly distant. And on quiet nights in that valley where rivers meet, when the wind moves through the grass on the hills and the water flows past the places where terrible things happened, you can almost feel the weight of what remains unresolved, the presence of questions that still echo across the years, waiting for answers that may come too late for those who need them most, but that matter nonetheless. The end of this story isn't written yet. Maybe it never will be. But the story itself, the memory of 5 people who deserved better, the dedication of those who keep searching for truth, that story continues. And in its continuation, there's a kind of hope, fragile but persistent, that justice, in whatever form it finally takes, might still be possible. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.